In the cold early hours of December 19th, 1944, a young American soldier named Harry Miller crouched inside the loader's seat of a Sherman tank. He was only 18, fresh to combat, and about to be tested in one of the most desperate defenses of the Second World War. His battalion, the 740th, had never seen action. They had trained for a mission that was canceled before it began. And now, with no combat experience and no working tanks just 24 hours earlier, they were the last line of defense at a fog-shrouded Belgian rail station known as Stumont. The German Ardennes offensive had exploded 3 days earlier. Kampfgruppe Peiper, one of the most feared Waffen-SS battle groups, had smashed through American lines with nearly 60 tanks and thousands of elite troops. Their objective was terrifyingly simple: break through the Allied front, capture fuel dumps, and seize key bridges that would allow them to split the Allied armies in half. If they reached the Meuse River, the war in the West could drag on for months longer. American First Army Headquarters was preparing to evacuate. Nothing stood between Peiper and his objective except a scattered, under-equipped network of American units scrambling to hold the line. Among them was the 740th Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Daredevils. Originally trained in Arizona as a specialist searchlight unit, they had been promised modern tanks by early 1945. But in mid-December, they had none. Their only option was to race to a forgotten depot at Spa, Belgium, and salvage anything with armor and a gun. What they found were hulks, burned-out, stripped, broken machines abandoned by previous crews. Miller, a mechanic-turned-loader, helped wrench breech blocks from gutted hulls, scavenge machine guns from shattered half-tracks, and patched together 3 Shermans and a single M36 tank destroyer in just a few brutal hours of work. By the morning of December 19th, those 4 barely functional tanks were all that could be fielded. With leaking hydraulics, unreliable radios, and faded ammunition, they rolled into position at Stumont Station. 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment had dug in along the road. Towed anti-tank guns were deployed to cover the approach. Everyone waited in freezing fog, praying the tanks would work when it mattered. Then the Germans came. At dawn, Peiper's panzers attacked. The 119th Infantry resisted fiercely, but they were pushed back. The SS captured a village just 2 miles east. Peiper's next move would be the station and the road that led to the Meuse. If he captured it, his tanks would pour through a gap that could sever Allied lines. The only armor left to stop him were Miller's junkyard Shermans and a handful of desperate Americans. They didn't hesitate. Miller climbed into his tank. The engine caught on the second try. The gun traverse wheezed but moved. The radio sputtered with static, but they could talk. With Lieutenant Charles Powers in the lead, they rolled out in column along the narrow Amblev River Road. The fog was thick, the path bordered by cliffs and a fast-moving river. There was no room to maneuver, no space for retreat, and somewhere ahead, German Panthers waited in ambush. At the first bend in the road, a camouflaged Panther was spotted. Powers' gunner fired first. The shot ricocheted into the German tank's driver compartment. Flames erupted. The crew bailed, some on fire. The column kept moving, edging forward through smoke and snow. Another Panther was waiting behind a stone wall. This time, Powers' gun jammed. His crew couldn't respond. The M36 tank destroyer, manned by a crew that had never fired its powerful 90mm gun before, rolled forward. Corporal William Beckman aimed, fired, and hit dead center. 3 shots later, the German tank was a burning wreck. They had no time to celebrate. The 3rd Panther was partially concealed, just a sliver of its gun visible. A lucky hit detonated a shell inside the barrel. The explosion peeled the tube apart like a blooming steel flower. The crew abandoned it instantly. By 6:35 a.m., the Americans had recaptured Stumont Station, 3 Panthers destroyed. 4 patched-up tanks had just stopped an elite SS unit in its tracks. But this was only the beginning. Through the next 3 days, Peiper threw everything he had at Stumont. He had 50 tanks left. American reinforcements trickled in. More Shermans, more infantry. The battalion now fielded 14 tanks. Not nearly enough, but enough to make the SS fight for every inch. The weather was merciless. Sleet and fog slowed visibility. Minefields littered the roads. German machine guns and mortars turned every barn and stone wall into a fortress. Tanks were knocked out. Shermans hit mines. Crews bailed out under fire. Still, they advanced. At Targnon, Miller's tank provided fire support. Inside the turret, the heat was stifling despite the freezing cold outside. He worked like a machine, loading round after round into the breach, sweat freezing on his collar as his hands blistered from the effort. Then came St. Edward's Sanatorium, a massive brick complex atop a steep hill. It overlooked the entire battlefield. Whoever controlled it controlled Stumont. The SS knew it. They assaulted it at midnight on December 20th, overran it with screams and flamethrowers, and pushed American defenders off the hill. Miller's tank sat helpless at the base of the cliff. Its gun couldn't elevate high enough to assist. Above him, he could hear the horror unfold. Grenades, screaming, fire. They could do nothing but wait. Rubel, the battalion commander, refused to give up. He commandeered a 155mm howitzer and personally directed fire onto the sanatorium the next morning. 50 shells slammed into the building like thunderbolts. Then Captain Barry tried something bold. He ordered the construction of a crude road up the hill under the cover of smoke and darkness. By dawn, tanks rolled to the walls. They blasted rooms from point-blank range. Infantry stormed inside. The sanatorium was retaken. Nearly 250 civilians, many of them children, were found in the basement, still alive after days of hiding. They had survived because of the impossible courage of tankers and riflemen who refused to let the SS win. The final blow came at L'Église, Peiper's last stronghold. Rubel directed another artillery barrage from the walls of Chateau Fray. Miller's assault gun joined in. Shells screamed overhead. The town burned. Peiper watched his once mighty force crumble. He had started the offensive with 5,800 men. By December 23rd, he had only 800 left. Surrounded on three sides, out of fuel, out of options, he gave the order: destroy the tanks, abandon the vehicles, escape on foot. Before dawn on Christmas Eve, Peiper and his remaining troops slipped away. They left behind 28 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and the wreckage of one of the most feared SS units in the war. They had been stopped by scratch crews, scavenge tanks, and raw courage. Miller entered L'Église on December 24th. The village was gutted. Burned tanks lined the streets. Smoke curled from shattered buildings. The only movement came from American tank crews and dazed civilians. The young loader from Ohio had lived through hell and helped write a chapter of history few would ever read. There was no rest. A week later, the daredevils were fighting again, this time alongside the 82nd Airborne, then the 8th Infantry Division, then others. They fought across Germany, always on the move, always in the vanguard. Miller learned to sleep while the tank rolled, eat while under fire, load shells without thought. By the time they crossed the Elbe River in late April, the war was nearly over. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. Miller sat on his Sherman's turret trying to grasp the enormity of what he'd survived. The 740th had seen 138 days of nonstop combat. They'd lost 57 tanks. They'd destroyed 69 German tanks and hundreds of other vehicles. They'd blasted dozens of enemy aircraft off the ground. They had been overlooked in the histories, eclipsed by legends like Bastogne and Patton's Charge, but they had stopped the deepest German penetration in the Battle of the Bulge. Captain Barry received a Silver Star. So did Lieutenant Powers and Staff Sergeant Loopy. Every tanker at Stumont received a Presidential Unit Citation. Miller received no individual medals. He was a private first class, one man among many, but he had loaded those shells. He had fought in that scrap heap tank. He had endured it all. After the war, he stayed in the military, Korea, then Vietnam, 22 years of service. He retired quietly, worked security jobs, took up jazz drumming in his 60s, and lived modestly. He rarely spoke about the war. Most daredevils didn't. In 1999, the Belgian town of Neufchâteau erected a monument listing every name from the 740th. Only a handful of veterans attended. Most were in their 70s and 80s. In time, only 6 returned for the annual reunions. The world had moved on. Miller died in 2017 at the age of 89, a man who had fought in 3 wars, loaded shells in freezing fog, and helped stop a German armored spearhead with nothing but courage, grease, and a Sherman that barely ran. He wasn't a general. He didn't command men. He didn't make headlines. But he held the line.